Tim Wyatt, who's a freelance journalist who specializes in this area, is going to examine whether terms like British Islam and French Islam have any real meaning, and whether we understand, when using those terms, we understand what we're doing. Tim, I hope you're with us. Over to you.
Thanks, Roger. It's great to be here speaking with you all. Thanks so much for joining us. As Roger said, what we wanted to explore in the next 45 minutes or so is to look at some of the fascinating developments occurring across the Channel in France, what the government is trying to do and how it grapples with French Islam, and then consider British Islam and what that looks like, how that's developing, and kind of compare and contrast the two. And we've developed we've got a great panel of guests I'm really excited to introduce to you to tackle this issue. So firstly, we have Joseph Downing. Joseph is a fellow in nationalism at the European Institute in the London School of Economics. We also have Jocelyne Cesari. Jocelyne is a professor of religion at Harvard Divinity School and the University of Birmingham. Also pleased to welcome Hakim El Karoui. I hope I pronounced that okay, Hakim. He's a writer and consultant and a senior fellow at the French think tank, the Institut Montaigne. And lastly, but not leastly, pleased to welcome Abdul-Azim Ahmed. He's the deputy director at the Centre for the Study of Islam in the UK, which is part of Cardiff University. What I'd like to do to begin with is look at, as many will know, the French government is in the process of passing into law a crackdown on what it's calling Islamic separatism. And there's among a kind of wide slate of reforms, Emmanuel Macron wants to impose further religious neutrality on state employees, to force community groups to sign up to French values such as liberty and equality, create a training program for Imams, and restrict homeschooling. Hakim, I wonder if I could come to you first. Could you explain what is the motivation behind this latest wave of reforms that are going through the French Parliament? What is leading Macron and his government to pursue this now?
I think the objective is twofold. First, reassure the French society about terrorism. After the terrorist attack against Samuel Paty at the Nice church, it was of the utmost importance for the government and for the president to have a very strong word about terrorism. Second, and the process lasted for around 3 years. The government tried to tackle the issue of what the president is calling separatism. I call it Islamism. To tackle this issue, not at the very beginning of the problem, but to try to block the spreading of the ideology. And at the same time, he tries to explain that it's not against Islam, it's against political Islam or Islamism. So we have these two objectives. First, have a very clear word against terrorism. Second, blocking the spreading of political Islam. In a French context, after 5 years of terrorist attacks and with 3 decades of debates about laïcité, secularism, the French are looking for real solutions. And the voice of the Muslims are now probably heard more loudly and more clearly. And at the end of the day, I think the text will not block the spreading of Islamism and is not really against Islam. Yeah, that's what I have to say. So thank you.
Thank you. Jocelyne, I wonder if I could come to you next. What's your take on these reforms? And could you explain a little bit about what the reaction from France's Muslim community has been to what the government is proposing?
First, there is indeed the timing and the electoral pace in which France is going now, and the fact that Macron is using the fair and I would say more than the fear, the anxiety that most of the French have vis-à-vis Islam. But again, this is not new. This has been going on for 3 decades. So unless we take a long durée, we say in French, view of what is at stake, we cannot just limit ourselves to the electoral calendar. And what is at stake here are 2 different things. First, there is a clear rejection of all kinds of visibility of religion in public space. And this is not particular to Islam. It happens that the Muslims are the most visible for multiple reasons that are too long to explain here. But most of the other religious groups, except a few cases, have now adjusted to the fact that religion has to be most of the time in the private space. But that's not true for religion. We know that if you know a little about religion, it's quite impossible to live it in your home or in your place of worship. And that's something that the French cannot accept for multiple historical and religious reasons that are related to the fact that the French modern democratic state was built against the Catholic Church. So it's deep down in there. And it's also taught and transmitted in the way that we educate the new generation of French. So this is one. And if we don't take this into account, if we do not revisit at some point, where do you draw the line between what is public and private, we're never going to understand why is it so emotional that even the hijab today or a few days ago, the French Senate was discussing the prohibition of hijab for young women under 18. While at the same time, we know that the legal age to have sexual relationship in France is 15. So you are not old enough to wear the hijab, but you are responsible enough to have sexual relations. So is there something in there that is really related only to, you know, the kind of exceptionalism of Islam as a religion to be accommodated in France? I don't think so. And all the surveys, again, I don't have time here, all the surveys show that the Muslims are, I mean, even having a question on French Islam, I'm not sure what it means, unless you want to feed the political meal, but there is a French Islam. The young people, they think in French, they dream in French. They may not be economically integrated, or they may not feel accepted, but they're French. Maybe not the kind of French we like, but that's not the question. And so the second reason, and I'm going to finish on that, don't worry. The second is what I call securitization of religion. And here again, we have statistics. Since 9/11, all states in Europe have started to control and interfere with all religious minorities everywhere. And French is on top. The French are on top. And what happened also in France, you have 2 types of discrimination, the governmental and the social. And in France, the level of governmental discrimination against religion is the highest. But guess what? For Muslims, and this is true for all kinds of religious groups, but for Muslims, on top of governmental discrimination, you have social discrimination. So it makes this a group very much on the siege, even if this group have lots of pitfalls and issues, it still is there a big, big concern. So securitization and laicity as a political culture of rejection of religion. That's what I would end up there. Thank you.
Thank you. President Macron has said in the past that he believes Islam is in crisis, not just in France, but around the world, and that there is some kind of enlightenment, some kind of reformation that needs to take place in the faith, that he wants to create what he has called an Islam of France. What exactly should we understand? What does he mean by this? What exactly is he aiming for in trying to construct an Islam of France?
Yeah, Islam of France is twofold. First, it's an organization. And second, it's a theology. A theology based on the criticism of the text. A theology based on what the French and the European did during the 19th century about the text of the great Christian text. if we don't have this criticism, we will not have the European Islam. And second, Islam de France, it's an effort to build a system based on French funding for Islam and French training for imams. And more important, French-speaking people on the social medias. But not French-speaking people influenced by the Salafi approach, but by a new way of Islamic interpretation. So French Islam is these two things: the organization, but also the theology. Of course, the government is not dealing with the theology, but the government can help for a new organization by banning imams coming from Algeria, Morocco, and Turkey, and by helping to train them and to find funding. And it's possible to find French fundings by the regulation of the pilgrimage and by the pilgrimage and the halal business. So it's on the way, and I don't know if we will succeed. I say we because I'm working extensively on this aspect.
I wanted to come to you, Abdul-Azim, to talk about from the British perspective. What do you know about how British Muslims, when they look across the channel and see what's happening in France, how do they understand it? How do they perceive what's going on? Do they fear what's happening there might happen here? Are there any people in favor of these reforms?
I mean, I think to understand some of what's going on, not just in France, but in Britain, other parts of Europe, we do need to kind of step back and have a look at the kind of political arrangements we're living in. So the nation state is something relatively new in a historical sense. And I think, quite a few scholars and academics who have looked at the nation state remark that in many ways, it's best understood as another competing form of religion. It has many similarities to traditional religions in terms of, considering itself the only legitimate identity and loyalty you can have, in being a repository of sacred values, of being a rejection of any other form of organizing community or society. So what you have in Britain, as well as in France, in other places too, is this clash between different communities who want to organize on different terms that the nation state is just not happy with. So that kind of comes to that question of, French Islam, British Islam, and how it's perceived. But I think on one hand, you can have this very, academic discussion about a localized regional variety of Islam, its idiosyncrasies, its unique context. And I think that's a, very rewarding avenue of inquiry. But I think it's important to understand that when governments and states speak about a, British Islam or a French Islam, very often what they're trying to argue for is an Islam or a religious context that kind of accepts the supremacy and the authority of the state as being absolute and almost comparable to some of the more sacredly held values of religious communities. So France is, I think, at an extreme end of this spectrum. Britain in the last 10, 15 years has definitely moved in that direction. So we have things like British values now enshrined in the curriculum. There have been repeated attempts to regulate religion in ways which I think do start impinging on civil freedoms. And I think France is, taking that logic to a much further degree because of some of the historical factors that Professor Jocelyne has mentioned, in terms of sort of a much stricter, a much less tolerant interpretation of what secularization might look like. But I think Britain is on that same spectrum. It's certainly heading in that direction of regulation. But I think at the same time, it does have a historical tradition, especially in places like Wales, of nonconformism within the Christian church, which give them a bit more of a space for, I think, religious groups to organize amongst themselves and to maintain those freedoms. But I think certainly, for British Muslims who are looking across the pond and looking at France, much of what's happening there doesn't feel too far off from what's happening in the UK.
Joseph, I wondered if you had any thoughts on that. Do you agree with Abdul-Azim's conception that this is a kind of clash between the nation state and the faith?
Not really. I mean, if I'm honest with you, sociologically speaking, there doesn't seem to be this mutual exclusivity existing in, I mean, I do most of my work in France, right? So within the Muslim community in France, as echo the sentiments that Jocelyne said, I don't think on the ground there's this conception that there's this inherent incompatibility between the two, right? Between a religious identity or religious ideas on the one hand and a national identity on the other. We see in many surveys, both British and French Muslims feel more British and more French than their kind of white Christian counterparts, right? And I think we have to be very careful here that we don't echo the politicians in a sense manufacturing a crisis here where there really isn't one, right? One thing that you can see definitely in a French context is an extremely high level of integration of Muslims in France that happens despite the state, right? So the state can go on the attack against religious symbols. The state can, new politicians like Macron can use the kind of Islam issue, right, to gain political capital when he's run out of kind of other options. But on the ground, there isn't this this massive clash of civilizations type situation. Olivier Roy, who's done a lot of work on Muslims in France, did an amazing blog post for the Huffington Post in 2015, where he made an argument that at least 10 times more French Muslims are in the French army than have ever gone to fight or be linked with Al Qaeda, for example, right? And I think this is the picture, this kind of bigger process of sociological integration, right, on the ground, is something that can be so easily missed when we discuss these kinds of debates. There will never be one single unified French Islam, in the same way there's no single unified French Catholicism or French Judaism, right? And I think this is where any government effort to codify and to control, whether institutionally or through funding, is doomed to failure, because people are diverse, right? So if you look at Muslims in France, for example, they will have cousins in other parts of the country that they will see as extremely different from them because of the regional differences within the French context, right? These kinds of things are important, and I think will mean that any, central state-funded sort of coherent view of a religion is just not going to fly. And it's not a particularly Islamic problem. This, I think, if the French government decided they were going to tell French Jews how to be Jewish or French Catholics how to be Catholic, you would have a similar sort of problem, right? And that I think is something that's really important for us to consider.
I guess, as Hakim has said at the beginning, that this comes in a context of which, there aren't a wave of terrorist attacks by people using the name of Judaism or Christianity. And Hakim and I think others would argue that you can't separate out the kind of laïcité issue from the reality that this does come within 5 years in which France has seen a string of extremely violent attacks by fundamentalists,
but it's also seen a string of times when those patrolling against these violent attacks are Muslims as well, and in much greater numbers. And that isn't something that's been publicly discussed. And I think that's important for us to remember.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, if you look at the biographies of jihadists, right, they're not being radicalized in NGOs. Mosques have not been these sort of nodes of radicalization in Europe now for some 20 years. Macron isn't talking about the role of social media. He isn't talking about the role of these other more diffuse ways in which individuals engage with radical content, which I think is definitely far more important.
Justin, I wondered what your thoughts on this are. Do you think the government in France will succeed in kind of corralling and reorganizing and controlling French Islam, or is it just there are many French Islams that always will be, and then there never can be this kind of top-down reorganization that will never be successful?
Again, this is not new. This has been going on for 2 decades now, and they have not succeeded. The fact that even in this new law on Islamic separatism, they have tried to build on cooperation with the Great Mosque of Paris and with the representative body of Islam, and this has fallen apart because indeed what we are witnessing here is a clear attempt of the French state to go beyond what the law of laïcité is. Article 1, the French state doesn't recognize, doesn't interfere, and doesn't fund any religious organization or group. That's not what they are doing with the Muslims. They are interfering, they are shaping, they are trying to build not a French Islam, but a sort of state controlled form of Islam, which is very much also in the mind of the French. You know, the French know how to deal with religion when they are organized like church. That's what Napoleon Bonaparte, in this case, did with Judaism. There was no central organization of Judaism in France. Napoleon brought together in a room, locked them, and said to the rabbi, you're going to get out of this room and tell him and respond to this question: what is your loyalty to the French nation versus Zion? And they had to do that. And interestingly, in the first steps of organizing French Islam, that's exactly the question that were asked to Muslims. So there is indeed a tension between national loyalty and religious loyalty, when this religious loyalty is also seen as a loyalty to another political community. The issue is indeed, and most of the surveys show that the Muslim in France are not trying to create a new Islamic state, that they are not even, for most of them, favorable to an inscription of Islamic law into French political or constitutional law. And when we talk about integration, we have to be very clear that there are several levels. There are the cultural, the religious, the linguistic, the socio-economic. And it's true that the French Muslims are not all at the highest level in all these dimensions. But it doesn't mean that they don't feel French. They, again, even if they don't master the language and they have the level of education of under middle class, doesn't mean that they are less French. I can give you tons of examples of young people who are not born in Muslim families who are going through the same challenge. It's about time that the French stop what I call culturalizing issues about socioeconomic, urban issues, development, urban development, the status of education in the French, way of promoting citizens. We are not talking about that. This is what's going on for tons of generations, but we are all focused on the Muslim aspect of it. And that's the most politically dangerous discourse you can have in France today, because it feeds. I have read all the former ISIS magazines in French aimed to the young people in France, and they are never talking about the caliphate or theology. They are telling them, you are in danger here, you have to go out. And this resonates. This narrative and rhetoric resonates with the way that young people, men, but also young women, are feeling trapped in this kind of impossibility to breathe outside all these issues that have now been Islamicized. And that's a very central key. And I do not see in France any political courage to distinguish all these issues. Let's talk about immigration, let's talk about urban issues, but don't put the Islam and Muslim everywhere in every aspect in it.
I think I might just come in there, if that's okay, Tim. I wanted to add to something the professor was mentioning, which is this issue of multiple loyalties. I think it is partly what's at stake, but quite often, as mentioned, Muslims are exceptionalized in this question. Where do your loyalties belong? And I think Jewish communities are sometimes, very often, I think, accused of the same, especially historically, in terms of loyalty, multiple loyalty, sometimes being disloyal. But I think we do have to also keep questioning why this frame of the nation state is so predominant. Why are we speaking about French belonging or British belonging when identities are much more complex? People have regional belonging, they have city belonging, they have neighborhood identities. These are all multiple identities people have and they build on. And I think it's just really about questioning this sort of the framework of the nation state as being so dominant and so absolute that we can only really approach even religion from that lens. And I think if you really start breaking down and you look at communities, whether Muslim or elsewhere, the local belonging that is often very strongly felt is undeniable, is very healthy, is very dynamic. But it's about, I think, again, sort of coming back to that question of the nation state being very poorly designed to deal with difference. And I don't think it just applies to Muslims. I think it applies to any type of minority group. There's a homogenizing, flattening desire of uniformity that nation states inherently create. And I think Muslims are very often in the firing line of this process. but not just Muslims. I think it applies across the board to different religious minorities, but also ethnic minorities.
And no, just to piggyback on that, in the French context, it's interesting to note, and this is something that we often forget, assimilation and laicite emerged in the French context without any consideration of Islam whatsoever. It was about integrating France's disparate regions into a central notion of being French, right? So the Breton, the Provençal, the Basque have, experienced this homogenizing tendency of the state. And I just want to piggyback again on this question of the local, right? So this question of Islam, what it means to be a Muslim or Arab or Black in France, is a lively debate that's taking place through voluntary sector organizations at the local level in French cities. So there's a very lively literature on the role of non-governmental organizations in mediating some of these questions, and they've been active in the French context in the urban arena for some 30, 40 years. So that's definitely something also important to consider in the French context.
If I can add something, also the French with the German are the one that have given the least room for representative of this Muslim immigration into the political system. There are very few people who are making it up to the top to talk about, their religion or their background in a way that is not heavily, I would say, interpreted or misguided. I remember when Rashida Dati was Minister of Justice, she said clearly, I do not want to talk about Islam and Muslim, because then she had a point in the sense that it was getting into a political game that was putting her outside of what she had to do. But we also know sociologically that if a migrant group or minority doesn't have representative, not only at the top, but at all levels of decision in the political system, the discourse doesn't change. And that's a big issue here that we are facing. So it's not only the Muslims, it's also how does the system make room for them on the long run as well.
Hakim, it looked like you disagreed with some of the things you've been hearing there. Did you want to respond to it?
No, I do agree. But I think the solution is in the hand of the French Muslims. The interference of the government is coming from the fact that the French Muslims are not organized. They are deeply divided into because of foreign influences. The Turks are dealing with the Turkish government. The Moroccan are working with the Moroccan government. The Algerian, they are no longer working with the Algerian government, but they are organized with money coming from Algeria. So if the French Muslims are ready to organize themselves based on their interest, understanding the fact that the rest of the society is waiting for them to tackle the terrorist issue, which is very, very hard and very, very important for the French society, they will be heard by the French government. And if they are ready to offer solutions for the funding, for the training of imams, and for blocking the spreading of extremist ideas, there will be, the government will follow what they say, because the administration knows that the former system no longer works. The interference of the government imposing solutions from outside, it doesn't work, and specifically to convince young people to change. So the solution is in the hands of the French Muslims.
Yeah.
Isn't that a deeply flawed assumption that unity is possible in a very diverse and homogenous group, or is unity even desirable in that particular context, right? I don't think government in France is ready. If there was this mythical kind of French Muslim solution to these problems, which is impossible, because many of the things like the spread of messages on social media are totally outside of the community's hands, right? Is the government really susceptible to significant change? I mean, we've got record here, like we have in the UK, of Muslim communities expelling radicals from their mosques, of being extremely reluctant to allow people in, right? And people like the Karoui brothers who committed the Charlie Hebdo attacks, radicalized in a park with a small group of friends practicing martial arts. Like, what solution could the French Muslim community offer to that kind of isolated radicalization that's so dependent on things like social media?
Yeah.
I mean, by offering, Jocelyne, by offering alternatives on the social medias.
But there is alternatives. They exist.
No,
right? French Muslims
no,
are
95%. Yeah, but if you look at the market shares brackets, if you are a young French Muslim, you are looking for information about Islam, you will be redirected to Salafi groups. They have 95% of the market share on the social media and on internet.
No, that's not
the Salafi
that's
and
not
the
accurate.
Muslim Brotherhood.
That's not accurate
Sorry?
on social media. The social media companies have worked extensively to remove that kind of content, right? If you look at
No. The Salafi, sorry, they are not violent. They are not violent. Yeah. They are just Salafi. And we have, I mean, all the figures, and I will share them with you if you want. On the social media, the situation is a nightmare. You find only extremists, not violent, but very, very, very conservative interpretation of Islam, and not the traditional way of Islam, and not, of course, the modern way of Islam.
I think I just want to clarify. I think this is a very old debate in a way. When I say old, about 15 years, definitely in the UK. But I think the idea of a link between non-extremists on one hand and then radicalization and violence on the other, I think that's a very poorly evidenced one. It hasn't really come across. You know, there are many groups out there who are very conservative, who may hold viewpoints that are considered unsavory or illiberal, but who have in their entire history never engaged in violence. And again, you know, there's been some really in-depth studies of, you know, groups, for example, who have joined the Islamic State and individual fighters. And again, their backgrounds are very often irreligious. They're very often involved in petty crime and violence and gangs. So it's much more helpful to think of these things through, I think, the sober eye of criminality than through sometimes the romanticized idea of ideology, because you know, it is very well researched and links are very tenuous.
Yeah.
I just wanted to move on because I'm aware there's plenty more that can be said on that topic, and it's a fascinating discussion.
I would like to say something here because
just very quickly, please, Jocelyne.
Because Hakim is right here. I mean, I have done also study of the whole offering of what is the supply of Islam, not only on social media, but on the internet as well. This is not about jihad. This is about a very not even conservative, is intolerant. It's modern actually, because Salafi and Wahhabi are modern, they are not traditional, and it's conveying a very destructive image of the environment in which the Muslim can live. And again, it's not because some of these groups are non-violent that their discourse is not appealing, because when these young people, we are talking about individuals here, we are not talking about organized conservative community. We are talking about people who are on their computer, get this message, and they can also get positions for very charismatic young leaders with a jihadi agenda. And the two are mixed, and that's what makes the situation very difficult. If there were on the internet alternative to indeed a more traditional, authentic way of dealing with Islam and the social issue in the plurality, it would be different. But even in some Muslim countries that are not legally Salafi, that's the dominant interpretation. That's what I keep saying. Where is the Islamic tradition? That's a response, not less Islam. Where is the tradition in the way of dealing with the Salafi and neo-Salafi messages?
Thank you. I wanted to, but we've only got a small amount of time left, and I wanted to also draw some of this across to our own context here in the UK. Do we think that a lot of the same issues we're talking about in France about lack of integration or alleged lack of integration, disconnection between the state and the government and on the ground, do we see similar things here in the UK, do you think, Abdul-Azim?
I think to a degree. Again, I think there's a spectrum. I think there are positives in Britain. I think some of this is due to the own internal organization of British Muslims over the last, few decades. So, you know, groups like the Muslim Council of Britain, the Federation of Sunni Islamic Societies, you know, they've managed to create a national profile, I think, more successfully than similar groups in Europe and France. Some of that is because I think there's a greater political openness to representation on this stage. But I think as well, there is a different element to it as well, which is this kind of shift, I guess, towards a more majoritarian approach within government, which is less inclined towards looking at things like diversity. So things like multiculturalism, it dropped out of usage with the Labour government. We moved to what was it, muscular liberalism, and it's kind of been moving in that direction over the last few years. So there are, I think, concerns and legitimate concerns that we might be seeing increasingly repressive and less open approaches by the government. But I think two things need to be taken into account in this picture. I think one is we've had an incredible suspension of civil liberties during the pandemic. And this is understandable because there's a necessary restriction on social life due to the very unique circumstances of a pandemic. But how do we come out of this, and what will the government be willing to let go of, having had such an incredible level of control? I'm not entirely certain what the picture will look like, but I'm certain that the regulation of religion that's taken place during this unique period has to be taken into account. And finally, and I'll be quick, is it's regionalization. So the UK has a very regionalized system: Scotland, Wales, England, Westminster, Northern Ireland, and I think that does help the picture in terms of there being different relationships with authorities.
One of the things that's really fascinating when you look at research and polling of British Muslims is that the younger generation of Muslims are interestingly actually more religious than their parents. More of them say that their faith is important to them and that they practice, but they also say that they feel more British than their parents and say they would prefer things like English-speaking Imams. Do we think that the Muslim community here in the UK is going to undergo some kind of significant change as it transitions towards being predominantly British born and bred, whereas in previous decades there's been a bigger mix of first and second generation immigrants?
You are right, but sociologically these young people are very British and very attached to their faith. The problem, and it has come in all the discussion, is the leadership. Who is guiding, teaching this new generation? It's certainly not the role of the family only, and that's where we see here the gap between indeed some form of leadership that are replicating or duplicating the discourse or patterns of some Muslim countries, and the one who are really working within the British culture. I'm thinking of Tim Winter. You have figure of this kind who is the lead of the Great Mosque of Cambridge. He's a typical example of the way that you can be British and Muslim without feeling any kinds of conflict of loyalty. But how many of those are there? That's the problem here. This is a structural problem. We can question the meanings or willingness of X, Y, or Z. This is a structural question of how do you build not only the loyalty of people, but the way that they can learn and know about their religion within the British context or the French context, that's the same thing, and without taking money, support, or even theological frame from outside. That's a huge, huge issue that all the countries in Europe are facing, actually.
I wanted to also open up before we've got about 5 minutes left, just under. So if anyone of our guests has a question from the floor, please do write something in the chat. I would love to hear some thoughts. We've got one that's come in while we're waiting. So as I said, please do write in the chat if you have any questions. But while we're waiting, one that's come in earlier, which was asking, is there a difference between the UK and France when it comes to social media, which we kind of heard was a big kind of talking point? Do we think, how does British Islam manifest itself in social media compared to the situation in France? Does anyone want to come in on that?
I mean, they show, it's something that I've done quite a bit of research on. They show quite a lot of similarities in many ways, actually, which is the mixing of many different themes and many different issues within a religious frame, right? So it isn't just that we're not talking about people discussing what it means to be Muslim, or being British and Muslim or French and Muslim in the sense of just about religion. And I think we have a problem here in that it's kind of too easy to pigeonhole that Muslims are just Muslims and just talk about Islam. They don't. And there's a lot of other stuff that emerges in terms of hybridized forms of culture, discussions of football, memes, jokes, all these other kinds of cultural forms, right, that are important to Muslims in their everyday sociological life.
That's interesting. Do you think that the kind of homogenizing that we've talked about, the kind of flattening out, is that particular to Muslims, or could if we had a group of British Jews here, would they say that they also feel flattened out and homogenized?
Well, no, it's very interesting because actually, if you look at the literature on diaspora, right, some of the founding literature from sociologists in the US discuss Poles, for example, right, Polish migrants to the US, discuss a second generation putting more of an emphasis on their religious identity than a cultural one, right? Because religion is for them this means of asserting something about being Polish when they're not really too sure about the Polish language. They lose their connection to Poland as a place that they go back and forth to, because, you know, before, international travel from the US to Poland was quite difficult. So it isn't something unique, right? And it isn't necessarily in and of itself something that's dangerous, right? When you ask somebody what it means if they feel religious, it doesn't mean that they are extremists. And that's what we see, and very much is neglected in both the British and the French context, which is, you know, French Muslims, British Muslims become rappers, open restaurants, do many things that we don't associate necessarily with this kind of Islamic frame, right?
If I may also add to that, this is a paradoxical moment where we are asking Muslims to create homogeneous institutions where all over religious traditions, these institutions are completely discredited by the young generation. It's not the diasporas only, it's also the long-standing established religion. In each of these traditions, young people are fighting against the institution. The Catholics, the Jews, the Protestant is different because in some way they have been always diversified in their organization. But everywhere you see this push against these people at the top, do not represent me. And so it's a paradox that we are asking Islam to go through a process that is now pretty much in discussion everywhere. So that's also why I think it's important not to look at Muslims on their own, but across comparatively to break this kind of so-called exceptionalism of Islam. The push against institution is everywhere. In America, for the first time, the people who do not belong to congregation is the highest. It's the first time in America. Why? Because all the young people are rejecting affiliation to, I don't know, the Presbyterian versus the Catholic versus this kind of religious organization. It doesn't mean that they are not spiritual and faith-oriented. It means that they do not think that this institution represents them. So that's tragic in some way, because the states do what they know how to do, but it doesn't fit anymore the demand of the aspirations on the ground.
If I could just come in with two final comments, which I think reflect on the question you asked him. I think the first is just to quickly say, there's a great work by Shahab Ahmed called What is Islam? And one of the points he makes is that during the process of colonization, a lot of the colonizing countries wanted to separate church from state, or in this case, mosque from state. But what they found is that Islam is very diffuse, and Islamic authority is very diffuse. It's spread, it's open, it's democratic in different ways. So in order to separate church from state, they had to actually create that church. They had to create a religious authority they could, regulate. And I think that's the same thing happening in a lot of these countries, Britain and France. There's a desire to regulate, but religion is very diffuse amongst Muslims, as there is in many other cases. And so there's a desire to create a single authority, a single institution with that authority backed up by the church state, so that the state can regulate. And I think that has to be conscious. And it's quite an ironic part of this whole debate on secularization. And the second thing, just to throw it in very quickly, which I think is really important, is sometimes we think of integration, but we're always integrating into this imagined model of something which is very often white and middle class and completely divorced from the reality of expressions on the ground. So if you go to somewhere like London, and this is a UK thing, and I'm sure it's similar in France, but I mean, Joseph may know better. I'm not very familiar with France. There's a very lively grime scene. It's a music scene.
Yes.
And the individuals there who are rapping may not be Muslim, but they're using Islamic lexicon, Islamic vocabulary, Islamic ideas. So what you have here is a very diverse, multicultural, multi-religious vibrancy going on, and that's life. And actually what's missing from that is that white middle class Eton type elite. So really, rather than thinking about where Muslims are integrating, it's about how we have a certain ruling class who are increasingly distant and divorced from the reality on the ground. those are my final 2 points. And there, back over to you, Tim.
Well, I think we've wrapped it up just in time at 12:45, so I'm going to call our conversation to a close there. But I want to thank all of our 4 panelists for their contributions. Azim, Joseph, Jocelyne and Hakim, it's been great to have you sharing your thoughts. I'm really grateful for you sharing your time. And back over to Roger and Hannah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you to all your fascinating contributors. Really very interesting session.